everyone. Welcome to the Washington Outsider. Today we are having an event focused on the human trafficking issue in the Mediterranean. Because it's such a big discussion, we've actually had to break up the panel into several parts, and it's going to be a whole series related to human trafficking, security, human rights issues. With us today are Mr. Said Mahack. He's an expert on immigration, asylum, and human rights issues, and he's also a professor of international law and international relations at the university in Fez. Mr. Ioannis Michaleto, political and security analyst, focused on Southeastern Europe, and Mr. Christopher Deliso, he's an American researcher and analyst, focused on Balkan and Eastern Mediterranean region, and an author of a book related to immigration issues. Translating with us today is Mr. Kamil Albashoka. Welcome, everyone. And my name is Irina Tsukerman. I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. We will start with Mr. Said, who can lay out the issues related to the Moroccan perspective on this, on human trafficking issues, the human rights aspect, the security considerations, and from there we'll go to the other speakers. And after all the remarks are finished, this will be followed by a Q&A, which I will moderate. And Camille, if you don't mind telling Mr. Said to stop, to take breaks so you can translate for everybody what he's saying.
مرحبا أستاذ سعيد، كيف حالك؟
I think he's having connection issues.
مرحبا أستاذ سعيد، هل تسمع صوتي؟ مرحبا أستاذ دكتور سعيد، كيف حالك؟ I think there is a problem with connection.
Is he able to hear us?
هل تسمع صوتي أستاذ سعيد؟ No, I have a problem with connection.
Well, why don't we, in this case, maybe start? Or is it working?
هل تسمع صوتي أستاذ سعيد؟
نعم، حاليا أسمع. شكرا على الدعوة وشكرا لكم.
عفوا دكتور سعيد، يبدو الصوت شوي عندك في خلل، لأنه ما أسمع عنه بشكل جيد يعني الصوت. Irina, there is a misconnection, I believe.
Okay, so if
أستاذ سعيد تسمع صوتي صح؟
حاليا أسمع لك.
تمام. شنو هو رأيك، لأنه يبدو خلل صاير بالنت، يعني تحب تتكلم أو شخص آخر يتكلم وبعدين تجي أنت تتكلم؟
لا بأس، امنح الكلمة لشخص آخر ريثما يتم إصلاح العطب التقني.
تمام، شكرا لك. Irina, I believe let someone else speak, then you can pass to Mr. Said because he has a problem with the connection now.
Okay, sounds good. I will then pass it on to Mr. Ioannis, and he can give his remarks, and then we switch off, if that's.
First of all, thank you, Irina, for the invitation, and hello to everybody. The issue is a multi-level one. I mean, when talking about human trafficking in the whole of the Mediterranean region, we're talking about various levels, which include organized crime, political corruption, geopolitical competition between different countries, and also ethnic conflicts. So because the time is limited, of course, we cannot examine the whole spectrum in just a few minutes. I will start with the organized crime activity in the region, depending on the specific sub-region. So, for example, in the Eastern Mediterranean and Southeastern European region, there are a number of both ethnic and mixed groups who tend to specialize themselves into actually transporting people to exploit them from the north to the south, from the south to the north, east, west, but not west, east. So we're talking about an industry that roughly has a turnover of around 6 to 8 billion euros per year. And I'm talking just about the Southeastern European and Eastern Mediterranean part of the whole issue. So the major activities are located between Turkey and Greece. We're talking about illegal immigration, but in an organized manner to exploit the people, use them as slaves. A lot of people who immigrate, for example, from Afghanistan into Europe, they don't have the money to pay the smugglers from Kabul up to Brussels, for example. That may cost them up to $30,000. So instead, they lease themselves. They don't pay anything. But once they reach the final destination, they will have to work without getting paid for a number of years to repay the debt. And the penalties, if they not actually do this, are severe, as somebody can understand. So this is a form of human trafficking. Another form is sex trafficking, which has to do with women, children, and young adults in 99.5% of the cases. So we're talking about people who are being shifted from a country to another country in order to be sexually exploited. So this is another big industry, which is, there are not enough statistics, but it's quite substantial. Now, if we take into account the situation in the wider Middle East and North Africa region, or let's say the war in Libya, destabilizing situations in Iraq and in Syria, of course, the war in Syria, the issues in the Sahel region and so on, there are a mass of people, massive number of people that are moving back and forth within different ethnic territories. And so we're talking about such a big phenomenon that encompasses possibly tens of millions of people. So I'll give you an example. Over the past 15 years, there's a lot of violence in Nigeria. You have the Boko Haram well-known terrorist groups, plus other frictions within different ethnic groups. There is a corridor for Nigerians to go into Europe through the Sahara Desert, through different caravans. One leads mainly into Libya, others reach up to Morocco or Algeria. And these people may take up to 3 to 5 years until they reach their destination. So we're talking about a very well-organized chain of people handling this movement. And the final destination is Europe. We're not talking about the United States because it's a completely different territory. But in terms of the European market, let's say, these people, once they reach Europe, they get heavily exploited and they produce profits for the people who handle them. They work for free. They handle drugs like drug dealers. So the actual drug dealers do not get their hands dirty and they don't get to go into jail. They get sexually exploited and they tend to become the underclass in the big metropolis in Paris, London, Brussels, or Berlin. So this is also a very severe social issue for the European countries. So this is in a nutshell my initial remarks, and we can move on after that.
Thank you so much. This was really a great overview, and of course, we'll be touching more in depth on these issues in the discussion. For now, we'll move on to the next speaker, Mr. Christopher Deliso, who can shed more light on the Balkans' contribution to this situation and how the Mediterranean and the Balkans relate in terms of human trafficking issues.
Well, I wanted to speak first in the big picture of the geopolitics of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans.
Mhm.
What is very interesting to me, having researched this since I was working on my book from 2014 to 2017, the historical and theoretical trends that we see reemerging in Europe and that have played a role over time. For example, you have some of the major European colonies, particularly France and Spain, as well as a bit of Italy and Belgium and other countries, having colonies in North Africa and other places in Africa. And this has remained. And Turkey, of course, with its Ottoman past, is reasserting itself across Northern Africa and in other African countries. So there is this historical background, and also within the larger European Union alliance, there are historical alliances. Say the Turkish-German alliance is underneath, but very powerful. And the Franco-Greek alliance is also very strong. The Vatican has a lot of emphasis and applicability in international organizations and at the United Nations. And all of these play a role when it comes to migration NGOs and human rights organizations, which tend to be the sharp end of the spear for policy discourse creation. Now, when we look at the Eastern Mediterranean strategically, in the Pax Americana, which we could say from 1946 until relatively recently, perhaps until 2011 in the Arab Spring, the threats were more contained. Under communism in the Cold War, it was typically shared as the threat would be from the Soviet Union, and the Western European powers were encouraged to form their union, but they were never expected to do very much, and NATO was the security blanket. There was never a possible security threat from the South. Now that the migration phenomenon has taken up so much space with the wars that have happened since 2011, there is a new threat to the European Union itself from the South. Also a new opportunity, because we saw as early as 1995 with the Barcelona process, the EU itself was seeking to get trade deals, free trade association agreements with the Maghreb countries. And over time, this has increasingly taken on the role of almost how the European Union treats membership candidate countries in the Balkans or Turkey or Eastern Europe. This is basically the European Union bills itself as a values-driven international organization, and therefore it can hand out money or withhold money based on the perception of the values of the countries that are being governed. And this has an effect on local governance and also in handling of the migrant crisis. The major trend that changed in 2016 was the Turkish-German agreement to stem the flow of migrants from Syria and other countries by providing large financial assistance. And just today it was announced that Turkey will be getting another 2 or 3 billion euros of assistance in order to keep migrants from coming to Europe. And I recall back at the time when that deal was first made in 2016, a lot of other countries were paying attention, especially Egypt and other North African countries, who realized that this was a precedent for how you can deal with your economic problems and overpopulation problems by threatening to send migrants to Europe. You could also get money back from Europe in order to prevent them from coming in the first place. So we are now in a very fluid situation whereby policy is regulated by a complex interrelationship of alliances that are both bi-national and multilateral. This has brought in new players such as China and Russia, where we see now, for example, Egypt is having a large problem with Ethiopia because of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance. And Egypt has threatened that it could even take military action against Ethiopia because of the feared loss of water in the Blue Nile to Sudan and Egypt. But at the same time, China is China is funding these dam projects in Ethiopia, and China is also funding ports in Egypt, as well as Greece and elsewhere in the Middle East. And so China has, out of nowhere, become a major player in controlling any potential conflicts in this region. So this is yet another element that was not in place during the Cold War and the Pax Americana. And all of these threat assessments have to be taken into consideration as we move forward. Now, Turkey keeps its migrant population so far at, I think, 3.7 million was the amount that I read today, for three purposes. One is for preserving this financial inflow from the European Union, which it uses against losses from mismanagement of its own economy. Secondly, it's, as we have seen in Syria, it's to try to replace the population of Kurdish areas along the border. And third is a form of asymmetrical warfare against the neighboring Greek islands, which is part of a much, much larger discussion over the Greek-Turkish maritime dispute, which was only exacerbated by the Turkish-Libyan decision, and as to form a exclusive economic zone. It happened in November 2019. And as we saw with Turkey's intervention in Libya, they also used an influx of migrants to Malta to have Malta block a decision of the European Union on the Operation Irina that the European Union currently has in place to stop weapons smuggling in the central Mediterranean. So migration has become a weapon of a new form of war that is not war. And all of the sides are trying to grapple with how to deal with it. And the EU has set itself up by calling itself a values-driven organization for potential accusations of, what is the word, of going against its own, of hypocrisy, of going against its own values. The aid agencies are the loudest in this, in saying that you cannot allow people to drown in the seas, but this also advances a policy of tackling this great border, which is the Mediterranean Sea. Most European citizens view this as the natural physical border between Europe and Africa. And in order for the EU to continue its enlargement across physical borders, it has to be activated in some form. So there are still a large number of people within Brussels who would like to have a European army. And of course, that's against what NATO wants. And since there is no enemy anymore, and the EU cannot act in any military capacity, the only way it could do so would be in a humanitarian one. And they have been able to use the migration crisis in this aspect as well, with Frontex, with Operation Sophia and Irina and so on, with getting drones, with getting ships, with all sorts of military technology that can be incorporated in this new theater of soft war. So this is how I see the geopolitical view, as a much more complicated one than it was 20 or even 10 years ago, with a large number of new actors, and the migration will increasingly influence countries who don't want to take responsibility for management of their own economies, to be able to say, if you have a large enough population, or potentially large enough population to threaten European planners, that you can ask for more funding or threaten that with destabilization of your country that they could come to Europe. I know from interviews with people in Brussels in 2016 that even back then, they were very concerned doing their threat estimates for the future, that the population of West Africa would double by 2050. And Europe and European countries, of course, have declining populations. And the decision makers in Brussels are now trying to figure out how best to deal with population overflows from the south to the north and how they can handle this in the most stable way. Thanks.
Irina, your voice, please.
If you don't mind briefly summarizing both of these comments from Mr. Said before we give him the floor, just so he knows what happened.
أستاذ سعيد تسمعني صح؟
أسمعك. مرحبا.
مرحبا أخي، كيف حالك؟ إن شاء الله بخير.
الحمد لله، بارك الله فيك.
الله يخليك. أنا بشكل ملخص أوضح لك الأساتذة إينس وكريستوفر ماذا قالوا حول الوضع الهجرة في منطقة بحر الأبيض المتوسط. فكانت مثلا الشخص الأول أستاذ يونس أكد بأن الوضع في بحر الأبيض المتوسط هو يشمل عدة ملفات. مثلا أولا هذه الهجرة غير الشرعية هي جريمة منظمة، فساد سياسي بين دول أو صراعات دول أو أو مشاكل أو توترات جيوسياسية بين دول. فكل واحد من طريقته يستقل هذا الوضع. على سبيل المثال في شرق بحر الأبيض المتوسط هناك صراع بين تركيا واليونان، صراع سياسي جيوسياسي. فأحد من الدول تركيا مثلا تستغل الوضع لهذه الهجرة، وأعطى مثال قال مثلا الشخص اللي يجي من أفغانستان على اليونان يحتاج أقل شيء 3000 لو ما يوصل لليونان 3000 يورو، ولا يملك هذا المبلغ، فيبقى في تركيا حر حتى يجمع هذه المادة ويعبر على اليونان بدون ما يواجه أي مشكلة. وقال مثلا من أكبر المشاكل اللي هي تحدث هي مثلا التجارة بالجنس، يعني يجي النساء ما عندها أموال تستقل، يعني المهربين يستقلونها جنسيا حتى تعبر إلى أغرب دولة أوروبية. وأعطى مثلا مثال آخر قال لكن منطقة الشرق الأوسط المتوسط يعني التهريب البشر ازداد فيها بشكل كبير، بالأخص بعد الحروب اللي حدثت بالمنطقة في سوريا والعراق وليبيا، لأن سيطرة الدول أو الاستقرار السياسي للدول يعني تم تدميره، لذا صارت فرصة للتهريب كي يزداد في اتجاه أوروبا. وأعطى مثال آخر قال حتى بعض دول أفريقية على سبيل المثال نيجيريا تعاني من حرب مع بوكو حرام وغيرها منذ 15 عام. لذلك هؤلاء الناس حتى يوصل أوروبا لما ما يهرب من نيجيريا يهرب في اتجاه ليبيا أو المغرب أو الجزائر، ومن هناك العصابات يستقلون مثلا بالأخص عصابات المخدرات كي يعمل لهم ببيع المخدرات وتجارة المخدرات بشكل مجاني، أو حتى النساء يستقلونهم جنسيا حتى توصل أوروبا. وربما بعض ناس يطول 3 سنوات لو ما يوصل أوروبا من نيجيريا. هذا من جانب كلام الأستاذ يونس. كلام الأستاذ كريستوفر ديليس كان هو أكثر ركز على النظرة الجيوسياسية، لأنه قال النظرة الجيوسياسية أكثر معقدة في وضع التهريب وتهريب الغير شرعي إذا ننظر للسنوات القليلة الماضية. وأعطى مثلا بعض يعني الأمثلة. قال مثلا كثير من يعني اللي يجون من أفريقيا حتى يعبر إلى أوروبا يختار الدولة. لماذا؟ لأن بعض الدول الأوروبية كانت مستعمرة دول أفريقية، فهذا المواطن الأفريقي يختار الدولة السابقة كانت مستعمرته حتى يتجه لها. وبعض منهم يذهب إلى تركيا ومن هناك من ثم أوروبا، لأن تركيا في ماضي كانت في عهد العثمانية أيضا كان لها وجود استعماري أو وجود سياسي على بعض الدول، فكانوا بعض منهم أسهل لهم يروح لتركيا ومن هناك يعبر على أوروبا. لكن قال إذا ننظر للتهريب من 1946 لحد 2011 ومن 2011 إلى هذا يومنا، فبهاي ال10 سنوات يعني بهاي المجموع ال10 سنوات أكثر ناس عبرت بشكل تهريب بطرق تهريب من السنوات الماضية بسبب عدم وجود استقرار سياسي اللي أثر على جيوسياسية المنطقة. وأعطى مثال، قال مثلا في عام 1995 أوروبا في اتفاقية برشلونة كانوا يسعون لإقامة علاقات تجارية مع الدول المغاربية أو المغرب العربي أو دولة البلغان، دول البلغان وتركيا، من أجل يخففون أزمة الهجرة، رغم أنها ما كانت مثل هذا الزمن، يعني حاليا أكثر. لكن ب 2011 الوضع تغير، أنه خرج من السيطرة. وأعطى مثال آخر، قال بعض الدول تستقلها سياسيا. على سبيل المثال ب 2016 ألمانيا عملت اتفاق مع تركيا تدفع لتركيا $2 مليار سنويا، وإلى هذا الزمن تركيا قاعد تستلم الأموال حتى توقف الهجرة غير الشرعية اتجاه أوروبا. ومثلا أعلن تركيا حاليا فيها 3,700,000 مهاجر مستعد يدخل أوروبا، لكن تركيا موقفتهم ل3 أسباب. سبب تاخذ تمويل من أوروبا بس بحجة وجود المهاجرين في أراضيها، والسبب الثاني تستقلهم في صراعاتها السياسية أو استبدال سكاني، والسبب الثالث تستغلهم كورقة ضغط على اليونان. وأعطى مثال، قال مثلا تركيا في حرب ليبيا استقلت المهاجرين على أراضيها في صراعها في ليبيا، جابتهم كيحاربون أو بتجارة السلاح. لذا قال هذه يعني هم تخوف موجود كمان، لأن ربما يحدث حرب، يحدث صراع كبير بين اثيوبيا ومصر، وربما هذا الصراع ينتج إلى حرب، فهذا راح يسبب هجرة أيضا من أفريقيا تجاه أوروبا، رغم أن الصين لها دور، لأن الصين هي تمول الصيد وهي تمول بجهة ثانية، ف يعني لها دور بازدياد هذا الصراع. ولذا قال أكد بأن أوروبا، كثير من الأوروبيين يعني صار عندهم هذه الفكرة، خل نؤسس جيش أوروبي بدلا من الناتو، لأن الناتو شغلته يحارب أعداء، يحارب بحروب سياسية، لكن نشكل جيش أوروبي حتى نحفظ حدود الاتحادية الأوروبية من الهجرة غير الشرعية. هذه المواضيع اللي أشروا عليها.
شكرا لك الأستاذ، وشكرا للأساتذة على مداخلتهم القيمة. سعيد جدا بالتواجد معكم
نفس الشيء
في نقاش هذا الموضوع الذي يحظى بأهمية بالغة، خاصة وأننا يعني في خضم جائحة كوفيد 19 التي لا شك، كما أكد ذلك التقرير العالمي الصادر سنة 2020 عن مكتب الأمم المتحدة للمخدرات ومكافحة الجريمة، أنها ستشكل عاملا مغذيا يعني لمزيد من جرائم الاتجار في البشر وتنامي الشبكات وسهولة يعني استغلال الضحايا نتيجة تفاقم يعني الأزمات الاقتصادية لما بعد الجائحة والعوامل المغذية لحركة التنقل والنزوح بالنسبة لملايين الأشخاص على المستوى العالمي. هو أكيد لظاهرة الاتجار في البشر عوامل كثيرة لا يمكن أن ننكر أهمية يعني العامل الجيوسياسي، وكذلك التوترات بين الدول وإشكالية استغلال الهجرة غير النظامية في المفاوضات ما بين الدول، وكذلك يعني مراقبة الحدود ما يتطلب ذلك من تنسيق إقليمي بين الدول، ويعني تعاون وثيق من أجل التصدي لهذه الجرائم. لكن أعتقد أن بالإضافة إلى هذا الأمر هناك عوامل أخرى، يعني حسب مكتب الأمم المتحدة للمخدرات والجريمة تغذي هذه يعني الجريمة التي أصبحت تأخذ طبعا عابرا للحدود. فتقارير الأمم المتحدة في هذا الأمر تؤكد على أن يعني عدد يعني الجرائم العابرة للحدود، جرائم الاتجار في البشر العابرة للحدود، تشكل من النسبة الإجمالية لمثل هذه الجرائم على مستوى العالم معدله 65%. 65% من جرائم الاتجار في البشر هي جرائم عابرة للحدود تمارسها يعني خارج حدود إقليم الحاملين الجنسية ضحايا الاتجار في البشر. ويعني 35% فقط من هذه الجرائم هي جرائم تحدث داخل يعني الدول أو الدول التي يحمل ضحاياها يعني جنسيتها. وبالتالي يعني يمكنني أن أقول في الإطار أن يعني مسألة يعني التوترات السياسية بين الدول واستغلال مثل هذه الملفات سواء الاتجار في البشر أو مسألة يعني تهريب المهاجرين هي مرتبطة بمبدأ أساسي تؤكد عليه اتفاقية قمع الجريمة المنظمة لسنة 2000 وكذلك بروتوكول باليرمو الخاص بمكافحة الاتجار في البشر خاصة الأطفال والنساء الذي هو مبدأ التعاون الدولي. مبدأ التعاون الدولي جعله بروتوكول باليرمو مبدأ أساسيا وكذلك يتعين على الدول أن تتعاون بشكل وثيق فيما بينها من أجل يعني رصد الشبكات ومتابعتها وكذلك أيضا من أجل بناء استراتيجيات وقائية يعني من أجل الوقاية من هذه الجرائم. كذلك مسألة أيضا يعني حماية الضحايا بما في ذلك تقديم الدعم النفسي ومؤازرتهم وكذلك تعويضهم عن يعني الأضرار التي تلحق بهم من طرف الجنات وكذلك أيضا يعني مسألة يعني التصدي والاستمرار في رصد الشبكات. ومن بين ما يؤكد عليه أيضا بروتوكول باليرمو وكذلك الاتفاقية التي هي أصل مكافحة مثل هذه الجرائم المنظمة هو ضرورة تنفيذ الالتزامات بين الدول بحسن النية. وبالتالي هنا يعني في الواقع يعني يتعين على الدول من أجل محاربة هذه الظاهرة ومكافحتها بشكل يعني إيجابي وفعال أن تكون يعني تنفيذ الالتزامات بحسن النية. ولكن دعوني أن أشير إلى مسألة على درجة كبيرة من الأهمية في هذا الإطار بحيث يجب أن لا يعني نخلط بين ظاهرتين مختلفتين. يعني ظاهرة تهريب المهاجرين هي شيء وظاهرة يعني الاتجار في البشر هي شيء آخر. فكما هو معرف في بروتوكول باليرمو وكذلك يعني في عدد من الصكوك الدولية والإقليمية الاتجار في البشر هو يعني في الحقيقة هو جريمة ضد الضحايا، جريمة تقترف ضد الضحايا بهدف استغلالهم. عرفه بروتوكول باليرمو كما تعرفون تعريف واسع جدا بكونه تجنيد شخص أو إيواءه أو تنقيله أو استقباله عبر استعمال القوة أو بالتهديد باستعمالها وكذلك أو استعمال مختلف وسائل الإكراه بهدف الاستغلال. بينما تهريب المهاجرين هي في الحقيقة جريمة يعني لحظية فقط، الهدف منها يعني غالبا منفعة مالية أو منفعة مادية أخرى. فهي مرتبطة أساسا كما عرفه بروتوكول تهريب المهاجرين عن طريق البر والبحر بكونها هي تدبير الدخول غير المشروع إلى إقليم معين أو تدبير الإقامة فيه بالنسبة لشخص غير حامل لجنسيته. وبالتالي هنا فجريمة التهريب هي في الحقيقة ليست جريمة ضد الضحايا من الأشخاص المهربين بقدر ما هي جريمة ضد القانون أو جريمة ضد الدولة. وبالتالي يتعين علينا أن نفصل بين هذه الجريمتين. وأعتقد أن هذا الإشكال يعني واجهته كثير من الدول بما في ذلك الدول الواقعة في حوض البحر الأبيض المتوسط. ولا بد أن نشير في هذا المضمار أنه خلال السنوات الأخيرة هناك يعني بروز لممارسات ناشئة لدى الدول من أجل التصدي ومكافحة هذه الجريمة، لا سيما أن عدد من بلدان المنطقة اعتمدت تشريعات تجرم يعني بشكل يعني فعال هذه الجرائم بما في ذلك يعني المغرب الذي عمل على اعتماد قانون مكافحة الاتجار في البشر سنة 2016، وكذلك أيضا تونس، وكذلك في مصر. أي أن هناك مجهودات، لكن يعني عموما في منطقة البحر الأبيض المتوسط التي تعتبر ملتقى القارات الثلاث لا زالت يعني هذه الجريمة يعني تعرف استمرار واضطرادا يعني كبيرا جدا، نظرا لارتباطها بالحركة الكثيفة والتنقل الكثيف بالمنطقة، سواء بالنسبة لشمال إفريقيا بالضبط وما رافق الانفلات الأمني في ليبيا من استغلال بالمهاجرين في هذا الإطار وما يعني الاتجار بهم، وكذلك أيضا النزاع في سوريا وما خلفه من نزوح قصري لآلاف الأشخاص، كذلك النزوح يعني أيضا والاضطرابات الأمنية في العراق كذلك. هنا لابد أن أشير إلى مسألة أساسية تتعلق بأن يعني بكون تدبير الهجرة غير النظامية في المنطقة الأورو متوسطية يعني رغم الشراكات القائمة سواء يعني في إطار مسلسل برشلونة الذي بدأ منذ سنة 1995 أو في إطار العلاقات الثنائية بين هذه البلدان الواقعة في شمال إفريقيا أو في حوض البحر الأبيض المتوسط بشكل عام والاتحاد الأوروبي، هناك أعتقد شراكات كثيرة في هذا النظام، لكنها ليست يعني فعالة من هذه الناحية المتعلقة بتدبير الهجرة النظامية. فإدارة يعني ملفات الهجرة غير النظامية بالنسبة للاتحاد الأوروبي هي إدارة مركزة يعني على الأمن العام، ولا تركز على جوانب أخرى التي يتعين فيها الاستجابة لتحديات وحاجيات الخاصة من الفئات الهشة التي تفر من بلدانها يعني بشكل جماعي ومختلط، الذي أضحى يعني في الوقت الراهن معقدا حتى بالنسبة للتدابير الأمنية التي يتم اتخاذها في هذا الإطار. لا بد أيضا من الإشارة إلى أن يعني الرهان على وقف تدفقات الهجرة المختلطة بالمقاربة الأمنية التي تنهجها بلدان الاتحاد الأوروبي. هناك مثل يقول في هذا الإطار، أعتقد أنه استعمله خبير سابق للأمم المتحدة في دراسته على الحدود الخارجية للاتحاد الأوروبي، فرانسوا كريبو، يدعى فرانسوا كريبو، قال أنه لا يمكن لبلدان الاتحاد الأوروبي إغلاق البحر الأبيض المتوسط مهما تكون التدابير الأمنية المتخذة، أو كما قال الأستاذ قبل قليل مواجهة يعني الهجرة غير النظامية عبر خلق جيش أوروبي من هذا القبيل. فهي يعني حلول أثبتت فشلها، ولا سيما يعني أثناء سنوات 2013 2015 أنتم تدركون يعني الانهيار التام للنظام الأوروبي المشترك للهجرة واللجوء وعدم قدرته على تحمل تدفقات المهاجرين واللاجئين، كذلك الاتجار في البشر سواء بالنسبة لليونان أو إيطاليا أو إسبانيا أو ألمانيا بنفسها. فلاحظتم كيف انهار ذلك النظام وأثبت عدم قدرته على تحمل تدفقات المهاجرين في هذا النظام. بالنسبة للاتجار في البشر أعتقد أنه لا بد من أن تكون يعني المقاربة صحيح أن تكون يعني بمعية السياسات المتخذة في مجال تدبير الهجرة بصفة عامة، لا سيما وأنه يعني حاليا هناك يعني ما يسمى بميثاق الأمم المتحدة الذي اعتمد بمراكش خاص بالهجرة النظامية الآمنة والمنتظمة، الذي يهدف بشكل أساسي إلى توسيع مسارات الهجرة النظامية كأحد البدائل للقضاء على جرائم تهريب المهاجرين وجرائم الاتجار في البشر. وأعتقد أنه ينبغي يتعين أن تراعى في سياسات مكافحة الاتجار في البشر مسألة يعني حماية الضحايا بالدرجة الأولى بغض النظر عن الاعتبارات الأخرى المرتبطة يعني بحسابات سياسية بين الدول، أو يعني حماية الحدود فيما يتعلق بالدول المحاذية لبعضها البعض. وهنا يعني لا بد يعني من مجهود جماعي من أجل يعني رصد الشبكات وكذلك حماية الضحايا وسن استراتيجيات للتعاون يعني من أجل الوقاية من هذه الظاهرة التي تثبت تقارير أنها رغم يعني المجهودات المبذولة فأزيد من حسب إحصائيات الأمم المتحدة في المخدرات ومكافحة الجريمة أن هناك أزيد من 65% من الدول قد اعتمدت تشريعات تتعلق بمحاربة الاتجار في البشر ومكافحتها. وكذلك أيضا يعني هذه النسبة 65% هي تعتمد يعني مقاربة شاملة لجميع عناصر المشكلة لهذه الجريمة، مقابل 16% من البلدان هي التي تعتمد يعني بعض العناصر فقط وليس كلها من أجل مكافحة هذه الجريمة. وكذلك هناك أيضا 80% من الدول يعني اعتمدت أو صاغت على الأقل يعني خططا وطنية لمكافحة الاتجار في البشر، لكن رغم ذلك لا زالت الأرقام في تصاعد. فيعني هذه الجريمة يعني أغلب ضحاياها بنسبة يعني 70% نساء في مقابل يعني 12% رجال، وكذلك 9% أطفال، وكذلك 13% فتيات. وبالتالي أعتقد أن يعني محاربة هذه الهجرة محاربة هذه الجريمة يعني يتطلب يعني مجهودات على المستوى الداخلي للتصدي أولا للعوامل المغذية يعني لهذه الجريمة التي هي بالدرجة الأولى عوامل محركة ودافعة للهجرة والتنقل وكذلك أيضا شبكات يعني تهريب المهاجرين أو شبكات الاتجار في البشر في الوقت الراهن يعني أصبحت تستفيد بشكل كبير مما توفره يعني شبكات التواصل الاجتماعي والإنترنت من إمكانيات واسعة لاستقطاب الضحايا والاتجار بهم. شكرا.
شكرا أستاذ، شكرا لك، كل الشكر. Yeah, I'm translating briefly what Mr. Said said about human trafficking, and but he added as another issue as illegal migration as well. First of all, he said we have to separate between human trafficking and illegal immigration, because illegal immigration probably someone just wants to cross border from country to country for political reason or economic reason, and it is very common in the world. But the most important issue is a human trafficking, and he said he gave the definition of human trafficking according to Palermo Agreement and how to confront the criminals who are behind the human trafficking. But in general, he wants to say the difference between smuggling migrants or illegal migrants and human trafficking. The smuggling migrants is a mostly crime against the law or against the state. So it is completely different than human trafficking, because human trafficking which affects the security of many countries with together, because they bring people from state to, maybe they cross borders from several states, and so it means they share the crime with different countries. But smuggling maybe just crossing borders for political reasons, so happens with between 2 or maximum 3 countries. He said he gave some example. For instance, said in human trafficking, 70% of victims are women, 20% are men, and others are children. So how we can stop this crime? He said the law of each state is not enough. So he said it's true, there is a political tension, there is a geopolitical reason between countries in Mediterranean regions, but overall the countries should sit with together and find a solution how to end the problem, how to find the criminals, and how to treat the issue, despite having geopolitical tension in the country, because human trafficking is definitely affect all nations. He believes after the crisis in Libya, Syria, and Iraq, the problem increased. But he believes even before 2001, the problem was threatening the security of North Africa and European countries. And he also believes Europe alone cannot settle the problem, because as we already seen how Greece, Hungary, Italy affected by illegal migrants, human trafficking. So he believes European countries must sit with other countries in like North Africa and find shared solution to end the problem. And he also said, for instance, in Africa, such as Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, they have their own law to confront the crime of smuggling. But these and they punish the smuggler or punish the criminals. But that one is still not enough to end the crisis. It's not enough to stop the human trafficking or the illegal immigrants. And as he said, in human trafficking, he gave some percentage. For instance, he said in human trafficking, 80% of a crime is happened between several countries. For instance, the criminals made the crime in Morocco at the same time the same group made the crime in Spain, in Italy, and Portugal, or any other countries in Europe. But in and 35, however, only 35% of the crime in human trafficking made in one country. For instance, only inside Morocco, or inside Spain. So he believes in human trafficking, 80% of it is of the problem is affecting several countries together. But in illegal immigrants, he said only 35%. He gives his sources, but I couldn't type the sources. But he said 35% of the crime in illegal migrants is happen between several countries. Is mainly affect inside the country or just crossing the border. In general, he said, we believe illegal immigration and human trafficking must stop and must end. But how? We know there is a geopolitics problem. We need everything, but we have to. The countries must sit together to find the solution and to end the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. By the way, if you are not speaking, if you don't mind muting yourself because there is some background noise, which makes it a little bit distracting. My first question is as follows, and I wanted to start with Ioannis, and then I'll go to the rest of the panel. Given that there is a difference between the human trafficking, given that there is a difference between that and smuggling, or just someone coming in, entering illegally on their own for whatever reason, what is the typical profile of a human trafficking victim, and how do the people still fall for this particular issue, as opposed to people who are not victims, who are just either voluntarily enter or find smugglers who are not traffickers? How does that actually work technically?
Is this for me, the question?
Yes.
Yeah. First of all, there's no such thing as a typical profile. On a social level, the vast majority of, actually almost all of the victims come from countries that have destabilization, extreme poverty, collapsing regimes, and so on. So this is the basis. I mean, This kind of crime thrives upon poverty and political and social destabilization. And in the vast majority of cases, we're talking about countries from the south and east, plus the northeast, the former Soviet bloc, the Caucasus region, Central Asia. So we have this social context. Now, every case is different. There are some people who get tricked. They have a false promise. Other people who might be suspicious, but they risk it anyway. They don't understand that the people who conduct the trafficking are professional criminals and they have a lot of means in their disposal. And the third aspect is the involvement of corrupt state officials in different countries that facilitate this kind of trafficking. So many of the victims believe that they can turn themselves, they can turn for help, let's say, for example, the police authorities of a country, but some corrupt police officers actually facilitate the traffickers, and then the victims realize that they made a mistake of entrusting their life with those people. So we're talking about people coming from poor or destabilized countries getting involved with organized crime. So another thing which is very important to note is that in most cases, the people who invest capital and activate themselves in human trafficking, they don't intend of doing this for the rest of their lives. Most of these organized crime syndicates then reinvest the money they make in drugs, in narcotics, which is the real big money. So what you have with human trafficking is proliferation of drug trafficking, because the primary accumulation of capital happens with humans, and then they go for the big profit yield, which is shifting products like heroin, cocaine, and so on. So it's not an isolated criminal issue. It interrelates with a high-level organized criminal action. So in all countries that the phenomenon of human trafficking was observed, a few years later on, about a decade, you had a mushroom of criminal narcotic syndicates. And after that, you have the penetration of these powerful networks within the political life of the countries, and a vicious circle then is ignited. More corruption leads to more destabilization, and so on and so forth. So this is a serious issue. Now, I wanted to note, of course, illegal immigration is separated from human trafficking. I was referring before about the cases where these two align themselves. For example, some people that don't have the money to go from a distant country to their final destination, they actually sell themselves to the smuggler until they repay. And in most cases, their body belongs to the smuggler until they repay, plus interest. So we're talking about slavery, which can last for years. And once you are into a slavery life, you become a victim, because usually more and more demands are made to you. You may end up in a state of mind that will certainly leave you serious psychological issues and so on. So this is a kind of illegal immigration which collides with the human trafficking aspect. And another thing is that the smugglers, I mean the organized smugglers, the ones who have legal businesses and they launder money because they facilitate the transfer of thousands of people per month or per semester, they're usually linked with the human traffickers, because they mainly use the same safe houses, the same logistics. They tend to bribe the same corrupted officials, and so on and so forth. Because in a country, it doesn't matter if it's a small country or a very large country, this kind of underworld tends to be specialized on a specific sector, a specific terrain, a specific network of people. So the people who deal with people, it could be forced trafficking or could be voluntary legal immigration, they tend to have the same support network by corrupt authorities, and to use the same hotels or hostels to hide the people, the same warehouses, the same shops to launder the money, and so on and so forth. So these two industries, they are kind of interrelated. In reality, there was a 2011 investigation by the Greek police. At that time, immigration in Greece was much less than it is now, because the biggest, let's say, inflows started post 2014, especially 15, 16, 17. So they noted down through these, I2 software analysis systems that all the networks that had to do with illegal immigration were clustered in very big ethnic cartels. For example, you had the AfPak region, Afghanistan, Pakistan. More or less, there were some key smugglers in these countries who control all the network up to Western Europe, and they were transferring tens of thousands of people annually. Then you had another cluster from the Kurdish areas, tri-border areas, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, also Syria, 4 borders. Then you had networks specialized on shipping transfers, who were the major facilitators, who were mainly established in Beirut or in Mersin in southern Turkey, and so on and so forth. So this networking was so elaborated that just in one smuggling network, there were 2,000 people behind it. Some were used ad hoc as drivers, just to make some money once a month, and some others were used for years to lease trucks, warehouses, as accountants, as lawyers, a lot of lawyers involved, and many other professions. So it was a very well organized machinery. And nowadays, this machinery is much bigger because we have to take into account the host countries. I mean, you had the smugglers who help the people move from one country to another, but then you have the ones who, let's say, accept them into the big urban centers in Europe and then further exploit them. And this is a very big industry. For example, anybody who has been, for example, to Rome or to Paris, for surely he has noticed that there are thousands of people selling, they operate like street vendors. They sell sunglasses, shoes, apparel, whatever is needed for anybody walking around in this neighborhood. These people, they're not entrepreneurs. They're part, in most cases, of cartels that lease the space, lease illegally. They let them sell in exchange of an illegal fee. There's racketeering involved, and they barely, most of them, make money to survive or just some money to send back home. The profit goes to the people who host them, who control the streets. So these people need more and more supplies of human resources, more people to use them. As street vendors, as drug distributors, street drug dealing, for sexual exploitation of all kinds, and as low-paid manual labor in various shops. So illegal immigration, again, becomes a vicious circle, because more and more people are getting involved, more and more money are at stake. And at the same time, if we take into account that the EU is investing heavily in creating an infrastructure based on non-governmental organizations, humanitarian organizations, public institutes, and private ones, there is a vested interest to have an ongoing immigration affair, which employs from a driver in the borders between Iraq and Turkey up to a high-profile academic in Brussels. The second one, of course, is not an illegal job, but both of them, they feed themselves through the same system. So it has been noted in human history that once a phenomenon becomes institutionalized, it cannot be stopped, especially if we take into account that the Middle East and North Africa region, the AfPak region, is being literally destroyed by wars, political turmoil, economic crisis, and about 1 billion people live in this wide area, the demand for immigration will rise and rise in the next decades. And the issue eventually will become explosive for both Europe and its neighbors. So it's high time for really both political and social forces to join hands, different governments, diplomatic circuits, and see how they can sustain this phenomenon before they become explosive. So starting from human trafficking, for example, we can see how the puzzle is being designed, and we see a bleak picture for the years ahead. And this is an issue I think that will have a devastating effect for dozens of countries. As far as human trafficking is concerned specifically, there's a lot of cooperation between different authorities in the European Union, also cooperation between the American federal authorities in the European countries. But the problem is that we're talking about a phenomenon that encompasses lots of people. The criminals are very adaptive compared to the states. So it's not that easy to actually say that one day this issue will just disappear itself. But compared to the 90s, I think there's an improvement in that very specific human trafficking segment. I mean, the situation in the mid-90s was much worse than it is right now, and this is due to enhanced international collaboration. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'll actually get back to some of the points that you made, which were very, very interesting. But I wanted to follow up on something with Christopher. You probably heard recently the announcement of a huge bust involving many countries and social media apps that helped bring down an enormous international trafficking ring that involved both human beings and drugs. And you mentioned earlier the emergence of new actors on stage that exacerbate these crises and different aspects of these crises. With respect to that particular case or similarly huge international operations, who are the new? What role do these new actors play? And simultaneously, are there new actors emerging that are helping in the fight against it?
Okay, that's a good question. I want to say in the strategic analysis of upcoming events, we should try to see farther than the next immediate crisis. Mm-hmm. So say, many of us missed Libya and the turmoil there, but we should try to see ahead. And where I would like to start is the EU has aligned itself firmly with the United Nations and the new US government in the 2030 goals of the UN about climate change. So here is a potential scenario assessment for exactly this region of the Mediterranean, North Africa, that could present itself based, let's say the current Egyptian rhetoric is that if Ethiopia builds a dam, there will be a shortage of water in the country, and they're pushing this very strongly. And whether or not it is true that, I think the Atlantic Council issued a report that the water shortages in Egypt are due to overpopulation mostly and not to the dam, but whatever. Probably they will support. There was a very fruitful conversation between Sisi and Biden today. And so I think that they're trying to get more multilateral assistance in this, but Ethiopia refuses so far. But let's just play devil's advocate and just let's assume that there was a water shortage that led to drought, and this incites discussion of climate change and discussion of mass poverty and starvation. And I'm old enough to remember in the 1980s when everyone was concerned about, ironically, the Ethiopians who were in that time starving due to a drought. And there was all sorts of world aid that was going on to help them. So with the aspects that are now major talking points for Western policymakers, including migration, including climate change, and the drive towards carbon neutral fuels and all of that, you have a perfect mix of things where another humanitarian disaster in North Africa could lend itself to a mass exodus of people. And how that is managed would be something that they would, hopefully try to work on in advance to, first of all, to prevent it from happening, because I don't think the EU can really afford to take in 50 million people from Africa. But they do not really talk about the alternatives. They do not work on the desalination plants as much as they did in Israel and Saudi Arabia and other countries. They're not very progressive in that sense of trying to find alternative solutions. So we have to be very careful when it comes to even the talking points that are today's talking points about migration could change in 2 to 5 years. The image that was very successful in 2015 when Angela Merkel wanted to invite all the migrants was when a small child was killed on the shore of Turkey, and it was on the world media covers, and she was on Time magazine as the headline was Chancellor of the Free World, and so it became a values and morals issue. On the other hand, she did not provide first-class plane tickets to bring all of these people that she invited. Instead, she made them to travel across multiple borders in a very dangerous fashion. And this is the big paradox that we see. The more that the aid organizations, and I know some of the people who work in them, and many of them do have very good intentions, but the more that they encourage people to do things that are extremely dangerous, like get in unstable boats and venture into the open sea, the more chances there are that you can have humanitarian catastrophes. So unless there are well thought out solutions by people who don't have particularly political designs on the process, I think we're going to just continue to see a wave after wave of unnecessary deaths. Because the other thing that people forget to talk about very often in the Arab Spring was this was partly motivated by this sudden new arrival of social media among the youth of the region, who had previously not had a smartphone before, or in fact, much of contact with the outside world. And now getting to see all of a sudden how people were living in other countries, and people at a very young age being very impressionable and thinking, the grass is always greener on the other side, let's go. This amount of media involvement made it very hard to control the movement of people in a logical way. It led to very emotive reactions on all sides, and it led to extremist politicians on all sides. And we're still sort of dealing with the legacy of 2016. So I don't know if that fully answered your question, if you had something else you wanted to ask, but that's how I see it.
It actually, in general, kind of addresses the larger point that I was making, meaning the emergence of these new media and the fact that there's, on the one hand, there is a growing cooperation on specific issues, but on the other hand, there is a complete lack of longer-term strategic cooperation. There's a law enforcement cooperation that helps bus rings more efficiently, from what I understand. But there doesn't seem to be a kind of a predictive mechanism at arriving at future crises. That's what I'm gathering from these comments.
Well, the way I see it now is within the EU, within, as I started with the historic context of its colonial presence, you have various rivalries and sub-rivalries. And the major one of the last 2 years was France versus Turkey for their colonial former prestige in Africa. And Turkey, since the AKP government began in 2003, has made a very serious investment across the continent in diplomatic terms, economic terms, military assistance. And this is paid off because they can get a lot of what they call the cheap votes at the UN to support their initiatives. But also, thinking in a militarily strategic way, they were able to build a choke point base in Somalia, and they participate in the NATO naval exercises in the Gulf of Guinea on the other side. And I think another thing to watch out for would be to see, do they wish to create a blue water navy in the Indian Ocean, perhaps working with Pakistan and Indonesia to recreate some of the former Ottoman things? Would they even challenge the French in Comoros to try to provoke another independence referendum for Mayotte, which failed in 2011? But this is all very strategic maritime area, and it hasn't been tested. But under the naval expansion strategy we've seen in the last 2 years, and the construction of what will become the first light aircraft carrier, there's clearly an appetite under the Turkish government. And we will see in 2024 what happens with the 50th anniversary of the invasion of Cyprus, whether something goes on there as well. And of course, France is angry that it hasn't gotten full acceptance. Its mission in Sahel has not gone as well as it had hoped. And I recall last year, Macron had invited several of the West African leaders, and he actually yelled at them and said that they should do more to stop anti-French feeling in West Africa. So Turkey plays a very clever game where they're not billing themselves as former imperialists. They say the West is the former imperialists, but they're fellow Muslims to the countries. And since we know that they had close ties with the Muslim Brotherhood under the current government, they would be happy to see Muslim Brotherhood governments coming into power across Africa, which is another thing. But above all of this is I think the emerging role of China everywhere. And who controls the ports is going to be who controls the human trafficking and the drugs trafficking and every other kind of trafficking. And because of the Belt and Road Initiative, China is controlling a large amount of ports in all the way from Asia to the Mediterranean, and even in Northern Europe, they have stakes. So we're going to really see, I think in the next 10 years, a real showdown between the people who can control the illegal migration and human trafficking flows, and they will play a much larger role in the decision-making at the highest levels of the United Nations and the highest level of bilateral and multilateral agreements. If you control the ports, and this is partly why the US kept the Chinese out of Long Beach a year or two ago, is that they saw this as a national security threat. And NATO has recently put China on notice as well. So whether or not the European Union has the same resolve, I don't think so. But we will see how this plays out in the years to come.
Thank you. And I will actually be back with some comments based on what you said. But now I want to turn back to Professor Mahack and Mahack and ask him to follow up on the Morocco issue more specifically. We are seeing that Morocco is carrying a heavy burden of guarding the passage to Europe from influx of illegal immigration and issues that are associated with it, human trafficking, drug trafficking, and so forth. We recently saw that some of there's been also border issues in the surrounding areas with the Libya, one of the countries through which illegal immigration flows, closing the borders with Algeria due to some security threats and issues between the two countries. But at the same time, there's also been concerns about continuous management of these issues amidst rising tensions between Morocco and Spain over unrelated security discussions. What do you see as the future of that regional aspect of issue management? Can Morocco, Spain, and others in their area increase their cooperation on fighting human trafficking, or is that going to be more of a challenge in light of the first financial costs and second political tensions? If you don't mind, can you translating that?
تحياتي استاذنا. استاذة أرينا سألت سؤال، هي من كل متحدث سألت سؤال، وتقريبا هم متفقين معك بأن هناك فرق بين التجارة والهجرة غير الشرعية والاستغلال البشر، لكن هم المجرمين هم نفسهم أكثر أوقات، يعني يحتمل هي تعريفها الدولي يختلف، بس هم المجرمين. وهم ردوا على سؤالها، لكن هي سؤالها حول المغرب، يعني كيف من الجانب الإقليمي المغرب راح تتعامل مع هذا الوضع، يعني تجارة بالبشر أو يعني تهريب أو عبر الحدود. كمغرب كدولة، يعني كيف هي تنظر للأمر هل من جانب إقليمي راح تحاول تحل المشكلة، أو هي كدولة تحل؟ بس أنا للاحتياط أسأل أرينا من جديد. Irina, the question is about regional aspect of Morocco to how to deal with the issue, or
with both influx of illegal migration from other countries through Libya and other places to Europe, and also the cooperation on fighting human trafficking amidst political tensions in Spain.
هو سؤالها
and actually European Union in general, not just Spain, including
European. هي سؤالها بأن هناك يجي تهريب، يعني من أفريقيا يجون ناس على المغرب، أو من ليبيا يتجون على المغرب، أو من المغرب يتجون على ليبيا، يعني تهريب موجود يحدث في أراضي المغربية، حتى من هناك يحدث التهريب على أوروبا. يعني المغرب مواجهة مشكلتين، فيجوها ناس بشكل تهريب ويغادرون البلد هم بطريق تهريب. فهنا الجانب اللي تاخذ المغرب كدولة في إطار الإقليمي مع أوروبا أو مع جيرانها الدول الأخرى، هو شنو من يعني كيف تتفق لحل هذه أزمة التجارة بالبشر والحدود، عبور الحدود بطرق غير شرعية؟ شكرا لك.
شكرا لكم السادة الأساتذة، وشكرا أستاذة أيضا. هو في الحقيقة الجريمتين مختلفتين، لكن المجرمين هم أنفسهم. لا بد من الإشارة في هذا الإطار أنه قد تبدأ في البداية، يعني جرائم الاتجار في البشر قد تبدأ في البداية بجرائم تهريب المهاجرين. فكما نعرف أن جريمة الاتجار في البشر هي في الحقيقة تركز في هدفها على عنصر الاستغلال. فعنصر الاستغلال هنا بالنسبة للمجرمين وللشبكات ينبع من استغلال وسهولة يعني استعمال نقاط ضعف الضحية. فالمهاجرين المهربون غالبا يعني ما يجدون أنفسهم في آخر المطاف ضحايا التجار في البشر، أولا نتيجة أوضاعهم الهشة سواء في مسار الهجرة بالنسبة للنساء والأطفال، أو لحظة الوصول بالنسبة للمهاجرين الذين يصبحون في إقليم الاستقبال، مهاجرين غير نظاميين يعانون من هشاشة قانونية، وبالتالي يكونون يعني معرضون للخطر أكثر من غيرهم من الفئات. هذا بالنسبة للنقطة الأولى. بالنسبة للنقطة الثانية عن التجربة المغربية، لا بد من الإشارة أن يعني اعتماد القانون 27/14 بالمغرب المتعلق بمكافحة الاتجار في البشر أتى في سياق إقليمي ودولي يعني تتسم فيه هذه الظاهرة بمزيد من التعقيد، لا سيما أن هذا القانون في المغرب يأتي في سياق اعتماد المغرب لاستراتيجية وطنية خاصة بالهجرة واللجوء التي كانت من بين يعني عناصرها الأساسيات هي الإطار القانوني المتعلق بالاتجار بالبشر وكذلك اللجوء وكذلك أيضا قانون الهجرة. وكذلك أيضا كان هناك عنصر أهم المتعلق بتسوية أوضاع المهاجرين غير النظاميين الذين بلغ عددهم نحو 50,000 مهاجر تم تسوية وضعيتهم بالمغرب. إذن فالقانون يعني المغربي فيما يتعلق بمكافحة الاتجار في البشر أتى في هذا السياق. طبعا بالنسبة للمغرب ينظر إلى هذه الجريمة على ما أعتقد يعني بفصل واضح ما بينها وما بين يعني تهريب المهاجرين. فاليوم أصبح المغرب يتوفر على يعني ترسانة قانونية مؤهلة لأن تكون فعالة في مكافحة الاتجار في البشر، وكذلك أيضا لديه نصوص قانونية كافية أيضا لمكافحة تهريب المهاجرين التي تندرج ضمن القانون الجنائي المغربي وكذلك أيضا قانون الدخول والإقامة في التراب الوطني بالنسبة للأجانب. إذن المغرب عبر اعتماده لهذا القانون فقد يعني أحدث نقلة نوعية في هذا الإطار، ومن بين البلدان التي تعتبر اليوم أنها تبذل مجهودات معتبرة فيما يتعلق بمكافحة هذه الظاهرة. فحتى يعني التصنيف الذي يعتمد تقرير الخارجية الأمريكية في هذا المضمار الذي تعده وزارة الخارجية كل سنة، فالمغرب استطاع بعد اعتماده الاستراتيجية الوطنية للهجرة واللجوء كذلك للقانون المتعلق بمكافحة الاتجار في البشر أن ينتقل من ناحية التصنيف من المرتبة الثالثة التي كانت تضعه ضمن البلدان التي تبذل مجهودات فيما يتعلق بمكافحة الاتجار في البشر إلى المرتبة الثانية التي يعتبر فيها المغرب اليوم من بين البلدان التي تبذل مجهودا معتبرا في مجال مكافحة الاتجار في البشر، لكنه رغم ذلك يظل ربما غير كافي. بالنسبة للمغرب في هذا الإطار لا بد من الإشارة إلى أن المغرب يعتبر من أهم مناطق العبور نحو دول الاتحاد الأوروبي، وكذلك تحول مؤخرا خلال العقد الأخير إلى دولة استقبال للمهاجرين ولو بشكل نسبي. طبعا في هذا الإطار يعني المغرب يجد نفسه بحكم الجغرافيا أنه أمام يعني مواجهة تحديات مرتبطة بهذين الموضوعين، سواء يعني الموضوع المتعلق بتهريب المهاجرين وكذلك يعني ما ينتج عنها من تعقيدات وتطورات قد ترقى إلى جرائم الاتجار في البشر. فهذا الموضوع أيضا في المغرب يعني دائما ينادي في سياسته الخارجية تجاه إدارة القضايا الهجرة الدولية بصفة عامة، وهذا العنصر أيضا كان من بين يعني العناصر المهمة التي ارتكزت عنها يعني السياسة الجديدة المتعلقة بالهجرة في المغرب، الذي هو عنصر يعني المسؤولية المشتركة للبلدان وضرورة التضامن فيما بينها فيما يتعلق بمواجهة هذه التحديات، سواء تلك المتعلقة بالهجرة غير النظامية أو تلك المتعلقة بمكافحة الاتجار في البشر. فرأينا يعني خلال العقد الأخير يعني أن المغرب كان منخرطا في مجهودات الأمم المتحدة في هذا الإطار، فكان قد استضاف سنة 2018 في ديسمبر 2018 بمعية ألمانيا المنتدى العالمي للهجرة والتنمية الذي كان منعقدا في مراكش. وخلال نفس الشهر ونفس السنة أيضا استطاع المغرب أن يستضيف مؤتمر الأمم المتحدة المتعلق باعتماد الميثاق العالمي للهجرة النظامية الآمنة والمنتظمة بمراكش أيضا خلال نفس السنة. فالمغرب يتابع مع دول كثيرة على المستوى الإقليمي ويقدم استعراضه كل مرة فيما يتعلق بتنفيذ ميثاق الأمم المتحدة الخاص بالهجرة النظامية والمنتظمة. وكذلك تجمع شراكات مع خاصة مع الاتحاد الأوروبي التي تتأثر سياسيا بما يسمى بإعلان الشراكة من أجل التنقل الذي وقعه المغرب والاتحاد الأوروبي وعفوا 9 دول من الاتحاد الأوروبي سنة 2013 الذي كان موازاة أيضا مع اعتماد المغرب للاستراتيجية الوطنية للهجرة واللجوء الهدف منها إدماج المهاجرين الذين تم تسوية وضعيتهم بالمغرب. طبعا كما قلت المغرب يقارب هذا الموضوع مع شركائه سواء على المستوى الإقليمي أو على مستوى العلاقة مع الاتحاد الأوروبي وفقا لمبدأ المسؤولية المشتركة والتضامن بين الدول. طبعا هنا لابد من الإشارة إلى أن ما زال هناك على المستوى الإقليمي إشكالات كثيرة في هذا الإطار. فالمهاجرين القادمين إلى المغرب خاصة أولئك الذين يقدمون إلى المغرب برا فمناطق ولوجهم إلى المغرب معروفة سواء عن طريق الحدود مع الجزائر عن طريق وجدة وغيرها من أماكن التي تعتبر شاسعة في الحدود مع الجزائر أو عن طريق أيضا منطقة الصحراء المغربية عن طريق الحدود مع موريتانيا. طبعا وهذا الوضع يتطلب من البلدان الجوار الإقليمي للمغرب تنسيقا وتبادلا للمعلومات تعاون وثيق واستراتيجيات مشتركة لمواجهة الشبكات التي تنشط على مستوى الحدود في هذا الإطار. طبعا ولا يمكن أيضا للمغرب أن يكون دركيا لأوروبا فمجهودات المغرب في هذا الإطار مهما كانت قدرته الاقتصادية والتنموية لن تكون كافية لسد موجات الهجرة القادمة إليه أساسا من إفريقيا جنوب الصحراء. لذلك يتعين على دول الاتحاد الأوروبي بذل مزيد من جهود من أجل فعالية الشراكة التي تجمعها بين المغرب وبين دول شمال إفريقيا بصفة عامة. فحتى مثلا مسألة إدارة الهجرة ما بين المغرب والاتحاد الأوروبي على مستوى الدعم المقدم من الاتحاد الأوروبي في هذا الإطار للمغرب يظل ضعيفا مقارنة مع المجهودات التي يبذلها المغرب سواء فيما يتعلق بتفكيك شبكات الهجرة غير النظامية أو فيما يتعلق بتفكيك أيضا شبكات الاتجار في البشر. فهذا الدعم الأوروبي يظل محدودا وغير كافي بالقدر اللازم من أجل التصدي لهذه الشبكات التي تستغل المهاجرين القادمين أساسا من إفريقيا جنوب الصحراء ومن بلدان أخرى. شكرا.
Yeah, Irina. Well, Mr. Said, answer your question more broadly, and he said about Morocco point of view and how to deal with this crime and in the Moroccan aspects in the region through coordination with different countries. Well, he said he believes, first of all, although these two crimes as human trafficking and illegal immigration are separate, but majority the criminals are the same. He believes that things. And he said majority of victims of children, women. So about the Moroccan policy, how to deal with this crime. He said, according to the Moroccan law 2714, which is related to combating human beings and human trafficking, the law or the country, the government, to coordinate with neighboring countries. So he said currently around 50,000.
Say something.
Pardon? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. I think there was he raised his hand. I think he was trying to add something. I don't know.
استاذ سعيد عندك سؤال عندك شيء لأن شافوا يدك مرفوعة.
عندي إضافة فقط ولكن يمكنني أن أنتظر فيما بعد.
تمام شكرا لك. Yeah, he will add later on. He said according to 2714 the law or the Moroccan government to coordinate with neighboring countries. He said currently there are 50,000 illegal immigrants in Morocco, but definitely there are more than 50,000, but 50,000 just registered. So he said Morocco as a country has a legal text for in a criminal code to fight human trafficking. He gave an example. He said American report, I don't know when exactly, but American report said Morocco was the third country, then moved to second country as a best country to combating human trafficking. And he also said, we can say in African region, Morocco is one of the most important countries to fight illegal immigrants or criminals who involved with these crimes, who wants to bring people towards Europe. So although he said Morocco faces challenge because Morocco has a limit power, finance power, or anything else. That is the reason he believes the coordination between Europe and Morocco should be increased. There is a coordination, but still not enough. And about international aspect of Morocco regional, he said Morocco is involved in international resolution to combat human trafficking. And he gave an example as a 2018 conference in Marrakesh. He said Morocco is dealing with many regional countries as well as Europe for this issue. He said, there is a shared responsibility between Morocco and Europe to deal with this issue. Because as I already said, Mr. Said believes Morocco has a limit power, financial power, or anything else to confront the problem. He gave an example why it has a limit power. He said there is a huge borders with Algeria and Mauritania, and the majority of illegal immigrants came from the desert between Mauritania and Morocco, or Algeria with Morocco. So coordination between countries is definitely required. And Morocco tried its best to increase its cooperation with other neighboring countries such as Mauritania and Algeria, or other neighboring countries to decrease the illegal migration. And overall, he said Morocco needs to increase coordination with European countries. There is a coordination, but not enough. He said European pays some finance to Morocco, but it is not enough. And yeah, that is summarize about what Mr. Said said. هل لديك شيء ثاني أستاذ سعيد حتى أضيفه؟
لا مشكلة. سأضيف بعد أن تمنح لي الكلمة فيما بعد، لا بأس. سأقدم الإضافة فيما بعد أظن.
Okay, شكرا لك. He said he can give his remarks later on.
Okay, sounds good. I wanted to come back to Ioannis and expand on a point that he raised earlier, which is the fact that European Union is creating an infrastructure that essentially encourages illegal migration, and by that same token, associated criminal networks, racketeering, human trafficking, and so forth, by creating dependencies on non-profit organizations and so forth. So the problem ultimately is not so much a lack of security or law enforcement prowess or limitations as a policy problem that creates the roots. And my question is, who benefits from it? Not the young people who get stuck in these endless cycles of nonprofit work. There's nothing new generated. There's no innovation. It's a kind of stagnant economy dependent on issues that never get resolved. And how is that going to work 10, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, if this issue continues to be a problem? If there is a new migrant or refugee crisis from, say, Egypt, Ethiopia region, or from another region, if there's we are seeing the issues in the Sahel, with jihadists, terrorists becoming increasingly more pronounced. They are probably on the road to an influx outwards at some point in time. We are seeing a potential for disaster, as you said, but we are also seeing a deliberate management, a deliberately managed, manufactured crisis. So what does that create a tension within different parts of Europe, for instance?
Yeah, this is for sure. Within the European Union environment, nowadays there are three camps. Mm-hmm. One is the hardline camp, which says no or limited immigration. Especially, I'm talking about the illegal immigration aspect. Mm-hmm. In this camp, you have the Central European countries, Hungary, Poland, Austria to a great extent, Slovenia, and so on. You have the liberal camp. The liberal camp actually are countries which are not so much affected. For example, Ireland or Finland, they're part of the liberal camp, although they don't have so many immigrants coming, which means they don't share the burden of the immigration issue, which is also a finance one, as it was pointed out. And the third camp are the major countries. We're talking about France, Italy, Germany, especially, and Spain, which take a stance which tries to blend in their economic interests, their geopolitical interests, and their value systems as a whole. What happens is Europe is composed by different countries. It's not a federation. It's not a single country. Actually, it's a single market dominated by some big countries and with the smaller countries orbiting around. So you don't have a cohesion. You don't have a leadership. You don't have a long-term vision. So what happens is when you have a lot of immigration, let's say from Libya into Italy, Italy tries to take advantage of it and pursue its interests in Libya. When you have immigration coming from Morocco into Spain, then Spain tries to intervene, and so on and so forth. So as a result, there's no strategy in the European Union. The strategy shifts from very liberal, what happened in 2015, then shifts to hardline one, and then shifts again into a liberal one. I'm afraid there's not going to be any clear stance in the coming years. And for sure, there's going to be a new refugee crisis because the situation in the MENA region is explosive. The situation in Afghanistan may become explosive with the forthcoming exit of the NATO and American forces. So basically, the Taliban will take over Kabul, as a lot of analysts predict. And we have also social tensions in various countries. We have clandestine organizations. Christopher mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood before that try to topple governments every now and then. And you also have the sub-Saharan Africa with an expanding population, extreme poverty, environmental catastrophe in some places, no infrastructure, and masses of people that, given the opportunity, will try to cross the Sahel and go into the Mediterranean. So for the time being, no political leadership in Europe has a long-term framework on how to deal with these issues. It's like we go as it happens, more or less. As a result, and concerning the issues of the human trafficking and the criminal networks, since these networks are very adaptive, they're actually practical people who work to profit, I mean illegally, but they know what they're doing. They are a few steps ahead from the government. So before even the new refugee crisis will become a reality, they will already have taken advantage of it. And when the states realize that another million people will be coming from the southern part of the Mediterranean into the northern one, it will be too late. So there is a need for political leadership in Europe that will see this issue on the long-term basis. And the most important thing is to stabilize the periphery of Europe. I mean, on the economic level and social level. As long as you have destabilization, you will have broken borders and you will have immigration waves coming, either from the south or from the east. So now we have also the Kovid pandemic, which further complicates things, because if we did this analysis in 2019, we will have some stable parameters. Right now, nobody knows how the COVID pandemic will influence the global south. What does it mean to have a global inflation in the price of grain, corn, and other basic necessities? And if that will lead in the short or even midterm at the latest, in social tensions in countries that import most of their foodstuff. I'm talking about Egypt, for example. It's very sensitive in the price of the grain, and also the livestock investment that needs corn all over the world. So when you have this this pandemic causing a global fluctuation in prices and inflation that may topple governments and upheaval whole societies, we may see in 2022 up to 2025 huge refugee waves coming into Europe. So it's better to be prepared than to be sorry afterwards. And I think it's high time for the governments and the private and the public institutes to pay attention to this issue, because it never stops. It's just beginning, I believe.
Thank you. And actually, turning to Christopher, I wanted to clarify another point. You mentioned earlier about the growing role of China in controlling ports and therefore controlling the types of trafficking that comes in. On the other hand, you have in the Balkans increasing interference by other major players, including Russia and Turkey. How do you and arising criminal networks and arms smuggling, drug trafficking, also human trafficking, of course, that is controlled through the associated cartels. How do you see these interests either clashing, coordinating, or otherwise influencing the future of this issue in Europe and beyond?
Well, that's a very good question also. I think what we have seen in the Balkans in terms of drug cartels has been driven by the expansion to connections with South America in the last 3 to 5 years of Serbian, Montenegrin, Albanian organized crime, which then proliferates throughout the Balkans and throughout Western Europe, and has I can see has increased even the level of domestic drug usage, as well as the amount of violence that is perpetrated. That things were not as violent before. It's typically a very safe area, despite all of the media and the history of wars and what people say about the Balkans. Is it's supposed to be a very safe area, and now the unfortunate reality is that because of the huge amount of money from drugs and to an extent their involvement in migration, as Ioannis was saying, it does trickle up to the level of governments. And we've seen various scandals involving high-ranking members of drug cartels and assassinations and things like that throughout the Balkans and Greece. So this unfortunately in the last 5 years especially has added a new level of instability. And people are becoming disappointed because there was supposed to be a new wave of enlargement in the Balkans, and now it's sort of on standby due to a number of reasons, but I think largely because Western Europe, specifically France, the Netherlands, and some other countries don't want it. And we could see this trend even as far back as 1999, when there was the twin earthquakes in Greece and Turkey, and Greece blocked its veto on Turkish EU membership. And ironically, all of the Northern European countries that had been telling Turkey, oh, we would love to have you, except for those problematic Greeks, were suddenly scrambling to come up with new excuses for why they had to block Turkey, because in reality, they could not have such a large and different country to come and upset the balance of power that Germany traditionally enjoys. So that is, Turkey's been a member state for I don't know how many years, maybe 50, but not a member, a candidate state. So there's this aspect to it too. There's tension boiling over impatience with the EU and countries that are seeing now with all of the new promises that the EU is making to put out fires south of the Mediterranean, why they are not tackling anything ranging from drugs, criminality, to growing environmental problems. And I think these are all related to organized crime as well. When you have such high levels of smog and burning chemicals in the air, things that did not used to be a factor at all, or to much lesser extent. And people wonder, where is the EU on this? If they're supposedly, caring so much about the environment, why are they not doing something about this? So you see that there's a level to which the EU is happy to put up with corruption and with mismanagement on a local level, as long as it's under control, when they have bigger problems somewhere else. And this is again perceived locally on, by the average person on the street as a credibility issue. And not only for the EU, but for their local governments that are pledging the citizens that someday they will have a future in the EU. And all this really does is it increases the desire for the average person in enlargement countries to escape. And we already saw this with the Eastern Balkan countries that joined. I believe Romania lost something like 40% of its young population, people who moved immediately to Western Europe and are probably never going to go back. So there's going to be a large problem on the pension systems in these countries in the years to come. And you can drive through large parts of the Balkans that are almost completely depopulated now because everybody has left. And especially with the COVID crisis, many trained doctors who are needed in countries that could pay more would move. So there's a brain drain problem as well. And all of this favors the development of criminal groups that can provide services with lesser qualified people. I don't know if that answers all of your question, but yeah, in terms of the other larger players. I think you mentioned Russia and China. I think that the Russian influence is a little bit exaggerated for domestic purposes in different countries, although you can see it, say, in Serbia, but we should remember that every country is unique, and in Serbia, they've inherited the central Yugoslav mentality under Tito of being the non-aligned country, the leader of the non-aligned movement, where they wanted to have good relations with both East and West, and they still try to do that to some extent. So that's to be expected from Serbia, whereas other countries sort of pick a side. And with China, it's much more complicated because they have a very pragmatic and very economy first approach. So the EU's strategic weakness is that they're taking a long-term view where they say, okay, we will give you aid if you follow certain values, and then we will take away the aid, or we will sanction you if you don't follow those values. And it's a sort of stick and carrot method, whereas China says, we don't really care. We don't want to interfere with your, your border wars or your internal politics. We just want to make business. But, on the other hand, if you can't repay your debt, we are going to take control of that strategic corridor, that strategic base. And so it's a very pragmatic issue, or that we will import Chinese workers so that they can give them workers instead of your local workers. And this is the other aspect of dealing with China. And you don't know whether the steel will be as good of a quality as under European produced steel or American produced steel. But then again, you don't have to deal with all of the annoying paperwork that the EU will give you, and you don't have to harmonize all of your legislation. But let's not forget that this can be a bonus for major European companies to outsource their production to developing countries that don't have to follow EU rules as well. So there's ways around it for all sides, and everyone is scrambling to get some sort of economic advantage. And the working class person is not really winning out in any of these countries.
Thank you so much. That was depressing but insightful. Turning back to Said, wanted to ask about the current situation. Following the U.S. Recognition of Morocco's sovereignty over Sahara, there was expectation that a number of other countries would follow with similar moves. That would have the advantage of kind of creating external network of support for the security aspect of managing local security issues. With Polisario and various other terrorist groups in the region, and of course one issue with having various separatist terrorist groups and entities in the vicinity of your borders is that you are going to have issues related to human rights over the populations affected by those groups. Polisario itself has control of in Tindouf camps in Algeria. There's human trafficking and drug trafficking issues there. There's Al Qaeda and ISIS movements in and around Maghreb. In general, there's concerns about that, but we are seeing that there is a conflict. There is some level of lobbying pressure for the European Union countries not to recognize Morocco's sovereignty in the area. What repercussions does it have for the security and human rights mechanisms and for the control of these attempted and in part Algeria-backed maneuvers that use human rights issues and humanitarian crisis as a point of leverage and as a weapon to create destabilization and also to attack Morocco and regional security in general?
أستاذ سعيد، السؤال هون من أستاذة إرينا أن بعض جهات هي لا تعترف بحدود السياسية المغربية، مثلا حركة بوليساريو، داعش، القاعدة، جناح القاعدة في المغرب العربي. هؤلاء الجهات لا يعترفون بالحدود السياسية المغربية. بالأخص الولايات المتحدة اعترفت بحق الشرعي السيادي للدولة المغربية في الصحراء المغربية، وتجد هنا دولة ثانية مثل الجزائر هي تدعم حركة بوليساريو التي لا تعترف بحدود السياسية المغربية. هنا السؤال: كيف هذه الجماعات مثل بوليساريو أو باقي الجماعات الإرهابية أو الجهات لا تعترف بالحدود المغربية لهم دور في وراء هذه الجرائم، تورطهم بهذه الجرائم، تجارة بالبشر، تهريب؟ هل يعني كيف هؤلاء يعملون هذه الأشياء؟ يعني كيف متورطين بهذه الأشياء؟ هل توجد يعني دلائل على تورط هؤلاء؟ كيف يعني؟
شكرا على السؤال، شكرا للأساتذة والأستاذة أيضا. هو في الحقيقة جرائم الاتجار في البشر هي جريمة منظمة وجريمة عابرة للحدود، هي جريمة يعني متماثلة ومتشابهة بجرائم الإرهاب والتهريب، وكذلك أيضا التجارة يعني بالمخدرات وغير ذلك من أنواع يعني الجرائم المتشابهة. طبعا جريمة الاتجار في البشر هي عادة ما تنتعش في مثل هذه الأوساط، يعني الأوساط يعني أماكن التي توجد في نزاعات ناشئة، أو الأماكن التي تعرف يعني عدم استقرار أمني، أماكن التي يعني تعرف يعني حركية تهريب كثيرة. ولا شك أن يعني هذه الجماعات التي ذكرتها يعني بما في ذلك البوليساريو وداعش وغير ذلك من الأنظمات الإرهابية التي تنشط في الساحل والصحراء، من الأكيد أن في صفوفها يعني شبكات يعني للتجار في البشر وشبكات تهريب يعني. وهناك يعني أعتقد إحصائيات في هذا الأمر وأرقام يعني مسكوت عنها لهذه الجريمة داخل هذه الأوساط. طبعا بالنسبة للمغرب في هذا الإطار يعني له من الإمكانية والقدرات يعني الكافية لردع هذه الجريمة وردع مثل هذه الجماعات التي ذكرتها بما فيها جماعة البوليساريو. المغرب يعني له القدرة الكافية على حماية حدوده يعني، وكذلك أيضا ليس في حاجة إلى لا اعتراف من الجزائر ولا البوليساريو ولا أي يعني جهة أخرى. المغرب يمارس حقوقه المشروعة والتاريخية في أقاليمه الجنوبية، ما ليس في حاجة لمثل هذه الجماعات بأن تعترف في حدوده. لكن يعني السؤال المطروح هو دعم بعض الجهات لمثل هذه الجماعات، خاصة الدعم الجزائري الموجه للبوليساريو يعني في وضع يعني يبدو على الأقل أنه مختل في القانون الدولي. كيف يمكن دعم جماعة مسلحة يعني مقيمة داخل إقليم دولة أخرى من أجل مهاجمة دولة جارة؟ يعني هذا إشكال أعتقد أنه يعني حتى من زاوية القانون الدولي هو إشكال يعني قانوني، ويعني يترجم بوضوح يعني العداء الجزائري للمغرب ولمصالح العليا للمغرب. طبعا الاعتراف الأمريكي بمغربية الصحراء يعني وضع هؤلاء أمام يعني أمر الواقع، ولم يستصيغوا هذا الاعتراف ولا زالوا لحدود اللحظة الراهنة يعني يراهنون على مراجعة الإدارة الأمريكية لموقفها في هذا الأمر. ومن المهم أيضا التأكيد على أن دعم مثل جماعة البوليزاريو ويعني أعمال العنف والتوترات الأمنية التي تسببها في المنطقة، ويعني لا يختلف كثيرا عن دعم يعني شبكات تهريب المهاجرين أو شبكات يعني الإرهاب في منطقة الساحل والصحراء. من المهم بمكان يعني أن تنتبه المجموعة الدولية إلى مثل هذه التوترات وإلى ما قد يعني تسببه من توترات أمنية في المنطقة. طبعا هنا لا بد من التأكيد أيضا على مسألة أساسية متعلقة بمحتجزي مخيمات تندوف. يعني هل فعلا المغاربة الموجودون في مخيمات تندوف فعلا لاجئين وفقا للقانون الدولي للجوء، وفقا لاتفاقية جنيف الخاصة بأوضاع اللاجئين، أم أن هناك يعني أشخاص ومجموعة أشخاص بما في ذلك الأطفال والنساء محتجزين؟ لاحظنا مؤخرا يعني في الأزمة الدبلوماسية بين المغرب وإسبانيا، لاحظنا مؤشرات كثيرة تؤكد يعني طبيعة التعامل التي تبديه التي تعتمد ما يسمى بجماعة البوليزاريو مع يعني المواطنين المحتجزين في مخيمات تندوف. ولحدود اللحظة الراهنة لا أدري لماذا ليست هناك إحصائيات بشأن عدد الأشخاص المتواجدون في المخيمات وكذلك أوضاعهم المعيشية هناك. فهناك تقارير تتحدث عن يعني جرائم اغتصاب وكذلك جرائم استغلال الأطفال وتجنيدهم وتسريحهم، وهذا الأمر طبعا منافيا للاتفاقيات الدولية بما في ذلك يعني اتفاقية حقوق الطفل لسنة 1989 وكذلك يعني بروتوكول المتعلق بعدم إشراك الأطفال في النزاعات المسلحة. يعني فالبوليزاريو ومن ورائها يعني الداعم الرئيسي لها للجزائر هي يعني منخرطة في هذا المسلسل يعني من انتهاك حقوق الأطفال والنساء بالمخيمات. هنا لا بد أن أشير إلى أن تقريرا يعني صادرا عن اللجنة المعنية بحقوق الإنسان سنة 2018 على ما أظن بشأن تقييمها لتقرير دوري للجزائر قدمته إزاء هذه اللجنة، فأكدت على الجزائر أنها لا يمكنها بأي حال من الأحوال أن تفوض لجماعة مسلحة فوق أراضيها اختصاص حماية يعني الأشخاص المحتجزين في المخيمات أو اختصاص يعني حماية الحدود الجزائرية. وعبرت عن قلقها إزاء الوضع في مخيمات تندوف، وأكدت عن مسؤولية الجزائر وكذا ولايتها القضائية على ما قد يقع من جرائم بالمخيمات سواء في حق الأطفال أو في حق النساء أو في حق الأشخاص بصفة عامة. وبالتالي هنا يعني أعتقد أنه لا بد من منظمات غير الحكومية وكذلك على الأمم المتحدة بما فيها المفوضية السامية لشؤون اللاجئين يعني أن تتيح المعطيات المرتبطة بالأشخاص المحتجزين في المخيمات، وكذا أن تتيح يعني تقارير يعني التي تترجم حقيقة أوضاع هؤلاء داخل المخيمات، وأن نعرف فيما إذا كانوا فعلا لاجئين أم أنهم محتجزين ويتعرضون لأبشع أنواع الاستغلال التي لا شك أنها تندرج في المعايير الواردة في بروتوكول باليرمو التي تعرف يعني معنى جرائم الاتجار في البشر. فلاحظنا كما قلت هنا أود أن أشير إلى أن يعني هناك مجموعة من الشكايات ضد يعني زعيم يعني من ميليشيات البوليزاريو بإسبانيا، ولاحظنا تقاعس العدالة الإسبانية عن تحريك دعوة ويعني توقيف هذا الشخص. توقيف هذا الشخص رغم وجود مؤشرات يعني كافية توحي بالاعتقاد أنه ضالع في جرائم اغتصاب وكذلك في جرائم احتجاز وتعذيب وغير ذلك، وهي جرائم في حقيقة الأمر بالنسبة للتشريع الداخلي الإسباني محظورة. وأيضا هناك يعني بعض من هذه الجرائم وجزء من هذه الجرائم اقترفت ضد أشخاص حاملين الجنسية الإسبانية. هنا يعني لابد يعني من يعني إثارة الانتباه إلى يعني كون أن يعني النشاط الذي تعرفه يعني الحركات الإرهابية في منطقة الساحل والصحراء، وكذلك يعني ما قد يعني يبدو من مؤشرات من اتجاه جبهة البوليساريو بخطوة حثيثة إلى يعني تحولها إلى منظمة إرهابية، يتعين على يعني الدول في المحيط الإقليمي وكذلك يعني الدول الجيران على المستوى الأوروبي أن يعني تنتبه إلى مثل هذه المخاطر وأن تتحمل مسؤوليتها من أجل ردع هذه الممارسات وما قد تسببه من يعني انتهاك الحقوق والحريات الأساسية للأشخاص ويعني اقتراف جرائم يعني عفى عنها الزمن في هذا الإطار.
شكرا لك أستاذنا. Yes, Irina, Mr. Said mentioned a lot of things about your question. First of all, he said illegal migration or cross-border is an organized crime, like terrorism or human trafficking is like terrorism, because it is an organized crime. And he believes this crime, human trafficking or illegal migrants, is thrives among these groups, as you mentioned, such as Polisario, ISIS as well, or Al-Qaeda in Western Arab countries. So Mr. Said said these groups are very active in the Sahel part and Sahara part of Morocco, meaning that they are acting on smuggling, human trafficking, crossing borders against Morocco as a state, and he also said Morocco in general is trying to deter these groups because Morocco exercises its historical rights, and overall Morocco doesn't pay so much attention for Algeria's support to Polisario group. Although Morocco is disagree with Algeria, but overall Morocco pay more attention to convince European countries and other regional countries to block Polisario and its activity. He said, Mr. Said said, Algeria said several times, the reason I am supporting Polisario is to protect international law. But it is not true, because Algeria is violating international law through supporting armed groups that are present in Algeria and illegally cross the border towards Morocco and bringing weapons and having camps inside Morocco, inside Algeria, and detaining women and children inside the country and don't allow them to return back to home. Mr. Said said overall, because he mainly focused on Polisario because Polisario has a base in Algeria, but Al-Qaeda and ISIS doesn't have base and just sometimes making some terrorism activity. But he said Polisario is involved in many problems in the region, not only tension with the Moroccan government, but and threatening the sovereignty of the state, but also they are involved, and the government has evidence to prove that they are involved with several crimes, One, detaining women and children in the camp, illegal camps inside Algeria. Second, they cross borders illegally and making some money through moving illegal immigrants from state to another, from their states to Morocco. Third, they are having involved in human trafficking, and also said they are, and he gave an example and how Polisario violated other people's non-Moroccan rights. For instance, several Spanish national citizens tortured by detained by Polisario inside Algeria, and he also said he mentioned the United Nations, particularly UNHCR, should put more pressure on Algeria to monitor the camps inside Algeria, because the camps, the Polisario is doing several things inside the camp, not only detaining women and children, but they are training extremist groups and extremist people to cross the borders, to make to threatening the sovereignty of Morocco. And he also said regional countries and European countries should view Polisario as a terrorist groups, because there are a lot of evidence to prove they are not a normal political party, but they are terrorist groups involving with several terrorist actions.
Thank you so much for these insights. Thank you to all the speakers. As you can see from this discussion, the topic is endless. We can talk about it for a very long time, and it's complicated. There are many issues, many actors, many aspects, and the problem is not just with the criminal groups who are facilitating these problems, but also the countries that are affected by them. There is a significant policy issue, a significant political problem that does not have the appropriate, that leads to the lack of deterrence, leads to the lack of appropriate solution and strategic foresight that could help prevent this crisis. So the problem is on both ends, on the supply end of the human traffickers and cartels, and on the demand end of the countries that are looking to stop the flow, but nevertheless seem to be playing right into the hands of their adversaries. We will be exploring this in a lot more depth in future. In July, we're hoping to hear different perspectives from lawyers, from people involved in the shipping industry, and how human trafficking affects that. We'll be looking at the inside of how human trafficking works, and in the future we will also be looking at specific cartels, their interests, their functions, and their interconnection with other security issues. Today we had the pleasure of having a great panel with and thank you, Camille, for translations, Mr. Professor Said Mahack, Ioannis Michaleto, Christopher Deliso. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your insights.
Thank you also.
Thank you.
I'm very much looking forward to future conversations on related topics. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
أستاذ سعيد، تتشكر من عندك كثير وعلى وقتك الذهبي والمعلومات القيمة اللي قدمتها حول تعاريف هذه الجرائم ودور حركات تهدد استقرار الدولة المغربية، ولديها يد في نشر هذه الجرائم وليس فقط الإرهاب. كل الشكر والتقدير لك.
كل الشكر والتقدير لكم أيضا. يعني شكرا للأستاذة على أسئلتها القيمة، وشكرا للأستاذين أيضا، وشكرا لك على مجهودك من أجل الترجمة ومن أجل إيصال المعلومات بالشكل اللازم، وشكرا لكم ولمجهودكم جميعا. تحياتي لكم الحارس.
He thanks everyone and particularly Irina for this lovely conference and your excellent questions towards the case and towards Morocco and other countries.